Welcome to another Apollo Papyrus podcast episode. I am Aaron Apollo Camp. For this episode, my interview guest is a U.S. Air Force veteran, a Greek Latin professor, and an author. As an author, he is the author of the Sigma series, with the first book in that series, Sigma Book 1, Thumos Rising, being available to purchase as of the upload date of this episode. His name is Demitrios Lopez, and my interview with Demitrios will follow the note-taking sounds. Demitrios Lopez, welcome to the Apollo Papyrus podcast.
Thanks, Aaron. It's great to be here.
Feel free to introduce yourself to our listeners and tell us about how your pen name came about.
Yeah, funny story. So, my real name is Justin Germain, but I write under the name Demitrios Lopez. As you said, I teach ancient Greek and Latin and a little bit of ancient history. Big fan of some of the big IPs from the 1980s, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, Conan the Barbarian, so on and so forth. Very much were inspirations for my work. But in respect specifically to the pen name, when the way this book came about, it started out as He-Man fanfic. And I went into a bookstore, this was about maybe 20 years ago at this point, and I wanted to find a He-Man novel, very much in line with some of the extended canon novelizations you can find for Star Wars, Star Trek, Spider-Man. I mean, a lot of IPs have this, right? And I was looking for something like that for He-Man, and I just couldn't find it. And I remember just being very appalled that I went to this Barnes & Noble and I couldn't find a He-Man book. So I came home and I said, okay, I'm going to write the He-Man book that I want to read. And that eventually morphed into what became book one of my fantasy sci-fi series, the Sigma series, book one, Thumos Rising. Initially, I wanted to kind of write it, put it out there, and sort of live with a little bit of anonymity. But then I realized pretty quick, Aaron, that if you actually want the book to sell, I have a great publisher, let me just say, and I really feel like they did everything they promised to do. That being said, they've got a lot of authors and a lot of books that they are representing, right? So if you want your book to sell, you've got to do a lot of the publication yourself, especially after the initial launch, especially after that first 3 months. So I found myself jumping on YouTube, jumping on Instagram, jumping on TikTok, and of course, my face is all over it. And at that point, I'm like, well, I'm not sure why I bothered with a pen name anyway, because just about everybody knows who I am. As far as how I got the name, I am ethnically, I am a quarter Greek and half Latino. So my father's name was actually Lopez, so that's where the Lopez came from. And Dimitrios is just a good Greek name. And I just thought it was kind of a nice melding of my two cultural heritages. And I just thought it kind of sounded like a cool name, right? I mean, it sounded like one of those names that totally sounds legit. If someone tells you they're Dimitrios Lopez, you're like, okay, that sounds like a real name. But it still sounds a little exotic and a little cool. So that's how I ended up landing with that.
You mentioned that you're a Greek Latin professor. What is it like to be a Greek Latin professor?
Great question. It's probably a little bit more like being a math teacher than one would suspect. As a matter of fact, I would say it's probably closer to being a math teacher or maybe a logic teacher than a traditional teacher of modern languages. With a modern language, something like Spanish, something like French, or even Chinese, if you just have exposure to the spoken word enough, you will start to pick things up, right? And you'll be able to, first, you can understand through the written word, then it's more listening, then you're finally able to speak. All that to say, I mean, there are plenty of people out there that are fluent in second languages that couldn't really diagram a sentence in a second language. As a matter of fact, I found that, having this job teaching these ancient languages, there's all kind of people that even in English can't really diagram a sentence. If you ask them what the direct object of a sentence is, you'd be shocked how many college students really couldn't answer that question, even for a simple sentence. Greek and Latin is unique, or are unique, I should say, in that you really have to understand the grammar. It is so grammar centric because the language, it's inflected, both of them, and the words actually change, not just the verbs, the way a Spanish verb would, for example, depending on who the subject is, the ending changes. But nouns change their forms as well, depending on the job they do in the sentence, be it a subject, direct object, object of the preposition, whatever it is. So a lot of it, Aaron, is it feels like I describe to my students, it's a little bit like you have this word puzzle and you're looking for ways out of the word puzzle to make it make sense. And the skill is to be able to take the grammar that you have and make your hole for exiting the word puzzle a little bit bigger. So it's quite fun. If you like Sudoku or something like that, I always say Greek and Latin's probably for you. You'd probably get a kick out of it.
And a lot of, even though English is a Germanic language, a lot of vocabulary in English comes from Greek or Latin.
Oh, sure. And that's especially true in respect to, I get medical, pre-med, pre-law students all the time that come through my classes. And I always say that both of those languages are great if you're planning on going on in those career fields. If you're going to ask me to like line up a 1A situation, I would say if you're going to go to law school, probably more of that verbiage than not is coming from Latin. If you're going to go to med school, probably most of our modern medical terminology is going to be coming from Greek over Latin. But they're both really good. And as you said, so much vocab is coming out, not just in respect to those fields, but just in general for the English language. A lot of English words are coming from Greek and Latin. And it really does help you understand the language a little bit better if you know some of those roots and where they come from.
Now it's time for me to ask you questions about your book series, which has one book out and more in the works. Without spoiling too much of the first novel in your Sigma series, and that is represented by the uppercase Greek letter Sigma. Right. Sigma Book 1, Thumos Rising. What is it about, and is it fantasy, science fiction, or a combination of both?
A combination of both. So, as I mentioned earlier, it's the world specifically of the Sigma series is very much inspired by the world of He-Man and the Masters of the Universe. And if anyone was familiar with that toy line back in the day, those cartoons and some of the other media, the comics and whatnot surrounding He-Man, you know that the world of Eternia, where the character is based, is a world full of both magic and technology. It has dragons and it has starships. It has swords and it has advanced weaponry, laser guns, those kinds of things. And so that's very much the world that the Sigma series is set in. And I do try to play with those elements and play with them in a very grounded, if I may, realistic venue. For example, in the first book, there's this I'd say about 3/4 of the way through the book, there is a large air battle between dragons and aircraft. And when you think about that, you're like, okay, well, I don't like, how's the physics of that going to work, right? Because these aircraft are obviously so much faster than the dragons. How could the dragons catch them? And you're right, they are faster, but you got to remember the purpose of a fight is to beat the other people, in this case, the dragons. And so they sort of almost have to get a little bit closer. And the dragons, although they're slower, they're much larger and their scale serves as sort of a natural armor, making it very hard for the aircraft to bring the dragons down with their projectile weapons, with their missiles and ballistics. And the dragon fire is incredibly potent. It is incredibly combustible, right? More so than any of the scientific progression that in the world you have at the time. So sort of playing with, again, just in my mind, going through this thought experiment, okay, what would it look like if you had this dragon that was very difficult to bring down with the weaponry that you have? Yet you do still have this aircraft that's much faster, the dragon's much bigger. And again, there's sort of an objective in the battle that the dragons are trying to do, and there's something that the aircrafts are trying to prevent the dragons from doing. So that sort of mixture between magic and technology and the more sort of Brandon Sanderson, Lord of the Rings style classic high fantasy vis-a-vis the more sci-fi elements and how would that actually play out in a real battle or a real interaction in the world.
What motivates you to write speculative genre fiction?
Okay, so I believe that genre fiction, in many ways, it's undersold. I think, and not undersold from a commercial standpoint, but I mean, I don't think it necessarily gets the sort of respect that it deserves. In that, I think a lot of people, they see a book with a dragon or a spaceship on the cover and they think, oh, well, okay, this is for a specific type of person and it's all going to be good fun. And that's fine. Everyone's entitled to have their fun, but it's basically popcorn entertainment, right? There's not too much deeper than just hearing a good yarn and being done with it. But um, I think that's unfair to what genre can be. So just to give you a great example, after World War II, there was a very short period where the United States, where the military was kind of running the show a little bit in Japan, or at least in certain sections of Japan, certain sectors. And at that point, you just had two atomic bombs dropped on you if you're Japanese. There's just a huge social consciousness and a huge social mourning that's going on for having lost the war, having been exposed to these atomic weapons that obviously had never been used before. And frankly, the Japanese really needed psychologically to have a national conversation about what that meant. Well, but it was almost too soon to talk about it directly. You couldn't really deal with it. And my understanding was there were certain limitations put on by the U.S. what could or could not be put out in the realm of the public discourse. So they couldn't have a conversation about what it meant to be hit with two atomic bombs, but they could make a movie about Godzilla, which in many ways was representative of the horrors of the atomic age. At least that first one was, right? And so that's what I think genre fiction can do for you. It provides what the philosopher Dan Dennett referred to as a intuition pump, right? So you have this moral conundrum, you have this very difficult issue that you're trying to work through, this very complex question, be it psychological, be it moral, could even be theological. But sometimes we're almost too close to the problem itself to see clearly. But what an emotion pump can do is it allows you to take that same situation, put it in different circumstances, sort of in an alternate universe, so to speak, kind of take the emotion out of it a little bit and say, okay, well, how do I actually feel about what's going on here? And I think genre fiction provides you an ability to do that that you simply can't do with anything else. Another great example would be if you want to have a really deep conversation about God, but you don't feel like you have, again, maybe you just don't feel like it's proper to question faith in this way or that. What you can do is you can have a really honest conversation about a character like Superman or like Dr. Manhattan. These, again, godlike messianic characters. What's Superman's responsibility? Having all these incredible powers in a world that's incredibly flawed, where people are going to make mistakes. When should he intervene? When should he not intervene? What's the role of freedom in that? You can sort of have a conversation about theodicy or just suffering in general for the human race and what that looks like in the context of Superman, and that can very much stand in place for the context of Jesus or some other higher power, right? So that's what I try to do, and what I've tried to do with the Sigma series. Yes, it's fun. Yes, it's entertaining, but I also ultimately want to get very existential and ask some questions, not so much provide any answers, but just ask the questions about what it means to have this human experience. And specifically for my antagonist, who is very much kind of a Superman messianic character, is it possible for a human being to start out fully human, evolve to a type of god or demigod, and yet retain their humanity? That's really the central question of the book series.
Your Sigma series has been described as a cross between Dune and Game of Thrones in novel form. How did Dune and Game of Thrones inspire your Sigma series?
Well, Game of Thrones, and I guess I should be completely transparent here. Um, I read some of the first book. I didn't finish it, but I did fall in love with the series. I think, like a lot of people, I'm trying to remember when the first one aired. At this point, it seems like about 10 years ago. One of the things that I really appreciate about the series, and my understanding was true of the books as well, is it very much took this very graphic, very gritty, very realistic take on fantasy. And that, in Lord of the Rings, you don't have people cussing, sexuality is played down. It's just a very much a cleaner, a more pristine world, right? Whereas in Game of Thrones, you sort of get into real real issues, right? And you actually have human beings, although they're living in a fantasy world, acting the way real human beings would act, and sometimes that is really, really badly. Uh, Dune, in many respects, and I have read Dune, uh, had, I think, some of those same elements to it, right? I mean, human beings are just a little more gritty and real in, say, Dune than they would be, and I'd say something like Star Wars. So to me, again, when you're trying to like pitch a book and sell a book, you're always like, okay, what is this closest like? If you enjoyed this, would you enjoy that? And to me, in respect to tone, it is very similar to Game of Thrones and Dune. That would be the combination. And again, going back to the sci-fi fantasy combination that I referenced earlier, I think that's the best comp. Now, that being said, Aaron, I think it's the best comp that people would be familiar with. At least the more general audience would be familiar with. Again, the Dune films were so popular, and they reintroduced the book series and Herbert's work to such a large audience. The Game of Thrones series was so popular when it was at its height. But to be honest with you, I guess even more closely than that, I would say that the series is more of a combination between Robert E. Howard's Conan the Barbarian and Geiger's Alien and Aliens mythology, in that it has both of these elements, but again, it is a very graphic, it is a very gritty. And I would say this, the book series is not necessarily for the faint of heart. So you have to be ready to somewhat be punched in the face a little bit by reality, even in these fantasy worlds. But again, and I know that doesn't appeal to everybody, but for those that it does appeal to, again, the Game of Thrones fans, the Dunes fans, again, if you are someone out there that love the work of Robert E. Howard, that harder, grittier edge with your genre fiction, I think you're really going to enjoy the series.
As you served in the U.S. Air Force, did your service in the Air Force inspire your Sigma series in any way?
Great question, and absolutely. So, when I was in the Air Force, I was an aircraft maintenance officer, which meant that I was in charge of taking care of the people that took care of the planes, made sure the planes were ready to fly whenever, wherever, depending on what the mission demanded. And so, one of the things that that really taught me, and in sort of a broader scale, I was really a logistician for the Air Force, right? And I think one of the things that gets glossed over with a lot of not just fantasy, but also science fiction is how the important role that logistics plays in these larger global conflicts, be it an individual battle or be it these larger machinations of nations. And again, in my series, it very much the conflict that's happening, that's playing out, is very much a global conflict on the world of Nineveh, the world where the Sigma series is set. So my experience as a logistician, as a maintenance officer in the Air Force really taught me a lot about the limitations of specifically air warfare, what you can and what you can't do with aircraft, what is maybe possible to do vis-a-vis not do, and maybe some futuristic alternate world. And it also just taught me the logistics of and the importance of making sure you have all your beans counted and you have a through line from, okay, this is how we're going to build the jet. This is how we fuel the jet. This is how we get the jet here. If we need to refuel, this is what we do. What happens if the power lines break? Well, we have to have a contingency plan for that. And so again, when you have a world that you are introducing magic into that, it really does, I think, even the playing field a lot more so than a lot of people would suspect. For example, if you have some kind of a power system that can power these aircraft, that's great, and that obviously gives you a huge advantage. But what happens if you have some kind of magical system that can undermine the physics that powers the aircraft? Well, all of a sudden, your fancy airplane is really just a decoration now, and it's not really going to do you much good on the battlefield.
As you mentioned in your response to the previous question, the fictional planet that your Sigma series is set on is called Nineveh.
Right.
What was it like to world build for your series, and did you create the maps of Nineveh that can be found on your website?
I did, and maybe if a little bit of a plug here, the software that I used to create that was Incarnate, and it's just one of those softwares where you can go on, you can create fantasy maps if you're a D&D gamer or something like that. It's just really fun, and as a matter of fact, you can, some of the ones that I saw, you could even create just for just your own artistic purposes. They're really beautiful. But the short answer is, Aaron, yes, I totally created the world. I created the maps. What I wanted a world that very much paralleled ours in respect to sort of who and sort of what kind of cultures and ethnicities are developing in which place. So, for example, I have a Viking culture in the book, right? And they are the version of the Vikings that you have on the planet of Nineveh. Obviously, they're living in a northern climate and they're very much seafaring, so they have to be very close to the open oceans to be able to utilize their ships. Likewise, the sort of Greco-Roman people are living in a Mediterranean type of environment. I got the name Nineveh. I just, again, being a student of ancient history, you just hear, I think, the coolest names. And there was a city in the Assyrian Empire known as Nineveh. People that know their Hebrew Old Testament might be familiar with it. This is, of course, the city that Jonah, if you're familiar with the Jonah and the whale story, or Jonah and the great fish, got in trouble for because he didn't want to go tell them to repent. But it was a major city in the Assyrian Empire, and I just thought it was like the best name ever, right? So I said, okay, I'm going to take that, I'm going to adapt it a little bit, and that's what we're going to call my world, Nineveh. All the peoples, and one of the things that I think is a little different, separates me from some other fantasy out there. And again, it's very much, I can't say it's original to me necessarily. I very much took this from Robert E. Howard and his Conan stories. If you read some of those short stories, then you'll find that the Stygians look a lot like the Egyptians. You'll find that the Picts look a lot like the Gauls or the Celts. The Aquilonians are kind of your almost stereotypical medieval fantasy armored knights on horseback type culture. And so that's true for my work as well in the Sigma series. Every group that you have, every nation, every civilization is based off some pre-industrial ancient slash medieval civilization in real history. And aside from having this playground where dragons can take on spaceships, you also very much have this playground that I think would appeal particularly to any kind of military history nerds, where you can speculate, or at least I speculate, okay, what would happen if you had an army that was a little bit like the Spartans, or at least based off the ancient Spartans with their, Greek hoplite style of fighting, versus the feudal Japanese viewed as versus an army of samurai. And okay, well, let's give them all sort of some advanced laser weaponry, some projectile weaponry. I don't call them lasers in the book, but something like advanced sci-fi guns, and let's see how that changes the mix a little bit. So it really is a lot of fun, and I do think it helped keep the series very much grounded in a very real way.
Atmosphere Press, which I believe is a hybrid publisher, published Sigma Book One. What was it like to get your book published through Atmosphere Press?
So I really can't say enough good things about Atmosphere Press in respect to, as I referenced earlier, everything they said they were going to do, they did. They were very good to me. Particularly, I have to give a really big shout out to my editor, Megan Sells, who just did a phenomenal job. When I went to her, she took the book in again, and the original draft of the book, it was almost in some ways kind of, it read almost like an ancient Greek history, in that, again, that's kind of what I do. I read a lot of these ancient texts, and so much of what my job is teaching students how to translate them, right? And one of the things that she did is she helped me take the book, make it in a more, I would say, contemporary form, to just make it a little bit more palatable, I think, for the average reader. I think she sort of reined in a lot of my Robert E. Howard, Conan fanboy proclivities. And just, she really did help make it a better book. It was just a better book after our meetings. I can't say enough good things. I will sing her praises to the moon. As far as the other press at large, I had great support with the cover. Again, some of the ideas that I had going in, which in themselves weren't bad ideas, but they helped evolve them to the next level. And I really think, and I was particularly proud of the cover. I sent the guy that was doing it, Ronaldo. I sent him. I just sketched it out myself, an idea of what I wanted. I sent some other comparable pictures in, and all of a sudden he sends me this beautifully crafted image, and I'm like, hot damn, that is my antagonist. That's the vampire right there. I want him on the cover. So, Aaron, it really was I think, a great experience in respect to, I almost compared it as to, you go into a cupcake shop and you think you know exactly what you want, and you get what you want, you get a sample of what you want, but they also give you, hey, this is what you want with a little bit of this. This is what you want with this kind of icing, not that kind of icing. And then ultimately leaving with a cupcake that was better than you had imagined to begin with. Obviously, publishing a book is hard, whether you're going to do it through traditional press, whether you're going to do it self-publishing, whether you're going to go the hybrid route. It is going to be work. It is going to be a challenge. You got to love the process. You got to love the editing process. And to some degree, I'm not sure how different that would be regardless of what route you went. But in so much as it's a labor of love, I got to say, Atmosphere Press, I really felt like they loved the book with me and they helped me do that work. They stood alongside me. So I think it's a great experience.
One final question. Without spoiling too much of the rest of the series, can you provide our listeners with a bit of a preview of the rest of your Sigma series?
Right. So again, this first book, Thumos Rising, as the title indicates, is very much about the introduction, and it's about my principal protagonist rising up and becoming the man that he's meant to be. And my protagonist is, if I didn't say this before, I'll say it now, very much a messianic, sort of a Superman character. One of the quick elevator pitches I developed for the book is it's in some ways it's Superman in Game of Thrones Dune world, right? Going back to that reference. But with that type of character, we're going to go with him as he goes through all the steps. And as we move into the second book of the series, which I'm hoping to have out by Christmas, I'm working on the second draft now to turn around and get it back to the editor. He's going to become a little disillusioned with some of the implications. Okay, I have all these great powers, and there's these real problems. There's this real deadly enemy out there that somebody needs to take care of, and I'm someone that can take care of it. And yet I'm constrained by many of the laws, many of the customs of this world that I live in, of these people that I am in a very real way trying to serve. So what happens when the people you are serving, when the republic or when the nation you're trying to protect becomes a bit of a chain? It becomes a chain to prevent you from doing the thing you need to do to protect it. That's the question that we ask in the second book. By the time we get to the end of the second book and then moving into the third book, it's going to be a little bit of my version of the Superman Injustice storyline. For those that are familiar with that storyline, he's going to want to break away from those things. But then ultimately, just like I think any good story, right? You have thesis, antithesis, and then finally synthesis. My main character Zeno is going to come back to a very good place, a very, I think, middle of the road place. And I will say pretty much the entire series, Aaron, I already have planned out. There's going to be 7 books by the time we're all said and done. I can't tell you exactly all the pit stops I'm making on that proverbial roadmap or the different sites that we're going to see, but I do know where we are, where we're going to go, and more or less the roads we're going to take to get there. And one of the really fun things about, I think, writing any kind of fiction is your characters really surprise you. And already my main character, Zeno, has been very surprising to me in a lot of ways. And at some point, you're thinking, okay, there's a certain decision I want or would like for him to make, to move the plot along. But then you say, well, but that's just not who this character has evolved to be. Like, he just wouldn't do that. So that's where we're going. And then by the time we get to the end of the series, the whole thing really is supposed to be a greater analogy for Platonism, for Stoic philosophy in particular. And hopefully by the time we get to the end, again, not only can people say, wow, that was a great time and a truly unique world, but they can also say this is something that really made them think and questions and challenge some of their own perceptions and beliefs.
Justin, thank you for appearing on the Apollo Papyrus podcast. You were an amazing guest to interview.
Well, thanks, Aaron. I do appreciate it. And for those that are looking for the book, again, the easiest way to find it is you go to Amazon and just type in Thumos Rising. It's exactly the way it sounds. You can also, of course, look at my website, demitrioslopez.com, and you can find me under both the name Demitrios Lopez and Justin Germain on X. I'm forgetting all my platforms now, TikTok and Instagram.
Demitrios was an amazing guest for this podcast, and I wish him well with the rest of his series. This is Aaron Apollo Camp reminding y'all to find your writing and reading purpose. Bye for now. Copyright 2025, Aaron Apollo Camp, all rights reserved. This podcast episode is intended for the private listening of our audience. Any reuse or retransmission of this podcast episode without the express written consent of the podcast host is prohibited except under fair use guidelines. Royalty-free music and sound effects obtained from https://www.zapsplat.com.